Ezekiel 33:3.
Hello and welcome to Wednesday Bible Studies. We're studying chapters 7 to 9 today of the book of Exodus. We'll do an overview of Exodus chapter 7 to 9. We'll have some questions from the study. We'll sign the reading from next week, and I've got some bonus material that have to do with the Pharaoh in Egypt and aligning it to the historical timeline. I think everyone will really like it. We'll start off with Exodus 4:21 to 26. And the Lord said to Moses, "When thou goest to return to Egypt, see that thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand. But I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I say unto thee, Let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn." So long before the plagues were even announced, even the first one, we can already tell that the last plague, it shows up here in Exodus 4:23. We can also see that Israel is called my first son. This is important because, of course, the first child had to be dedicated to the Lord. We see that later in the Bible. And then we see that the reason why the Pharaoh won't let the people go is not because the Pharaoh is hardening his own heart. It's because the Lord is hardening the Pharaoh's heart. And we're going to take a look at the reason why. So we're going to start with our overview of Exodus chapter 7 to 9, and we'll start with, obviously, Exodus chapter 7. We'll take a look at the lineage that we're dealing with first here. So we'll take a look at the 12 tribes of Jacob, or the 12 tribes of Israel. So we had Abraham, his wife Sarah had a child called Isaac, and then Isaac and Rebekah had two children. They were twins, Jacob and Esau. Jacob was the younger, Esau was the older. And then Jacob was renamed Israel. So Jacob or Israel, it's the same thing. Jacob had a wife named Leah. She was the older sister of Rachel. And Leah gave birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. Levi is where you get the Levites. Levites were the priests we see in the book of Leviticus. And from the Levites, we find Moses and Aaron. So if we take a look at the Levites, we have Kohath and then Amram. Amram was the father, Jochebed was the mother. We brought up before that the name Jochebed has the name Yahweh, or the Lord, right in the name. And the question becomes, how can the mother of Moses have the name of God in her name, considering that Moses was first given the name in Exodus 3:14? So that's just a logic question. The mother should not have had the name. But this might actually tie us back all the way to Genesis 4:26, and the fact that people were using the name of the Lord as an idol. They were basically idolizing themselves. They called themselves by the name of the Lord, and this shows up in the 1611 King James Bible. Exodus 7:1, the Lord answered Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet." Moses was to be God to Pharaoh, and Aaron his prophet. Exodus 7:2 to 5. You are to speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. And then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and by my mighty acts of judgment I will bring the divisions of my people, the Israelites, out of the land of Egypt. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch my hand out against Egypt and bring the Israelites out from among them. Through miracles and mighty acts of judgment, the God of Israel was to display he is the Lord. When Moses and Aaron spoke to the Pharaoh, Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 years old. We grabbed that detail from Exodus 7:7. So Aaron was the older of the two. It's interesting because, of course, when we looked at Jacob and Esau, Esau was the older, but we saw the inheritance all went to Jacob. Well, here we see a situation where Moses is the younger, and again, we see this framework being followed over and over again. We have the first plague. The first plague was blood in the river Nile. We see that in Exodus 7:14 to 25. It reads in Exodus 7:20, "And the Lord said to Moses, Tell Aaron, Take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers and canals and ponds and reservoirs, that they may become blood. There will be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in the vessels of wood and stone. So it wasn't just the river Nile, it was basically all the water. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded. In the presence of the Pharaoh and his officials, Aaron raised the staff and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was turned to blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. And there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. Now you'll notice here, whenever Aaron is supposed to perform one of these miracles, he always has to hold the staff. Because remember, the staff, we find out later that it starts to bud. And so if the staff is budding, what you're seeing here is a living piece of wood, even though it's a broken stick, right? Because normally when a stick is just dead in the wild, it just starts to decay. But obviously if it starts to blossom, it makes it look like that staff is alive. So that symbol is a symbol of Christ. So every time that Aaron has to perform a miracle, he has to put that staff forward because it resembles the power that's coming through the Lord. It's not like they're performing these miracles on their own. All these miracles are being done through the Lord. So let me go back here. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded in the presence of the Pharaoh and his officials. Aaron raised the staff and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was turned to blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water, and there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. The Egyptian magicians were able to do the same through their magical arts. So we would see Moses come up and Aaron, and they'd perform a miracle on behalf of the Lord. But then we saw that the Egyptians, their magicians, were able to copy some of these miracles. The word magic arts shows up in Exodus 7:22. The word magic arts is actually secrecy or mystery. And I think this ties actually to the end of the Bible where it talks about mystery Babylon, the mystery religion. So again, we see this word mystery whenever we see the word magical arts being practiced by the magicians. The word is lat, and lat means secrecy or mystery. And in the King James, sometimes it'll translate this as enchantments. The 10 plagues of Exodus. So we've got plague number 1. The first plague was blood in the Nile River. What was the outcome? The Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So once he saw the magicians and Moses, they were both able to turn the water into blood. Pharaoh didn't care. His heart was hardened. But of course, his heart wasn't hardened on his own behalf. We know that all the way back from Exodus 4. It was the Lord who said he would harden his heart. We'll explain why later. And if we take a look here, we can see turning the water into blood, the magicians were able to do that. So we're going to give a check to the magicians to show that they were able to perform the same miracle as Moses and Aaron. So the first plague was blood in the river Nile. 7 days passed after the Lord turned water to blood. That's the only miracle that we see in Exodus 7. So the overview of Exodus 7 is the Lord told Moses that he had made Moses into God for Pharaoh, and Aaron was his prophet. The Lord told Moses that Aaron is to tell the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, but the Lord would harden the Pharaoh's heart while signs and wonders were multiplied in Egypt. The Lord said that he would bring his people out of Egypt through mighty acts of judgment. The Lord told Moses and Aaron that when the Pharaoh tells Moses to perform a miracle, he will direct Aaron to throw his staff down and it will become a dragon, a crocodile. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. The Pharaoh called his wise men who were able to do the same things by their magical arts, but Aaron's staff swallowed the other staffs, but the Pharaoh's heart was still hardened. The Lord told Moses to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go or the Nile would turn into blood and the fish would die. Moses did what the Lord told him in the presence of the Pharaoh, and when he told Aaron to take the staff and stretch out his hand, the waters of Egypt became blood, even the water within vessels of wood and stone. The magicians of Egypt were also able to do the same with their magical arts, and the Pharaoh's heart was even further hardened. 7 full days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. We're going to take a look at Exodus 8, and we will come back to that line that was talking about throwing the staff on the ground. In Exodus 8, we see the second plague. The second plague was the infestation of frogs. Exodus 8, 1 and 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and tell him that this is what the Lord says. Let my people go, so that they may go and worship me. But if you refuse to let them go, I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile will teem with frogs, and they will come into your palace and up into your bedroom and onto your bed. Into the houses of your officials and your people, and into your ovens and kneading bowls. The frogs will come up on you and your people and all your officials. And then in Exodus 8:7, we see, but the magicians did the same thing by their magical arts. Again, that word magical arts, it's the word mystery. So they were able to do this through some kind of a mystery. And they also brought frogs up onto the land of Egypt. Okay, so we have frogs being brought up by Moses and Aaron, and then we have the Egyptian magicians that are also, through their mystery, bringing up frogs from the Nile. So we have 10 plagues of Exodus. We've now seen 2. Plague number 1, blood in the river Nile. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Magicians were able to perform the miracle as well. Miracle number 2, or plague number 2, infestation of frogs. Pharaoh's heart was softened initially because when the frogs were devastating Egypt, he asked Moses to basically pray and have the frogs go away. But then once his wish was granted, what did he do? He hardened his heart again, because that's what the Lord said he would do. And we saw that the magicians were also able to perform this feat. The third plague, swarms of gnats. Now, the third plague and the fourth plague confuse a lot of people because they're a little bit similar. You see a plague of gnats and a plague of flies, and people would ask the question, well, what's the difference? Exodus 8:16. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, that it may turn into swarms of gnats throughout the land of Egypt. If we take a look at the word gnat, gnats translated as gnat, gnats, or swarm. But I noticed something interesting when I was reading this. In the King James Version, it's not a gnat. If you look in the King James, we'll look at chapter 8:16. And the Lord said to Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout the land of Egypt. And they did so, for Aaron stretched out his hand and his rod and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast. And the dust of the earth became lice throughout the land of Egypt. The King James Version Bible translated gnat as lice. So we can see there's a difference, obviously, between a fly and lice, because flies would basically fly around, get in your hair, skin, whatever. But gnats and lice are more specifically talking about things that are small, that like live on the skin and live in the hair. The Egyptian magicians unable to bring forth lice themselves. So they tried to basically perform this feat. And this was the first time we saw the Egyptian magicians. They're not able to perform this feat. So they're not able to bring forth the lice. Exodus 8:16. And the magicians did so with their enchantments. So this is King James Version. The word enchantment we're looking at is, again, magical arts, which is mystery. So the magicians did so with their mystery to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there were lice upon man and upon beast. Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. What's interesting here is they say this is the finger of God. Normally we say things like this is the hand of God. The reason why I thought this was kind of interesting is because when Moses gets the 10 commandments, keep in mind there's 10 plagues. Moses gets 10 commandments. He gets the 10 commandments after they come out of Egypt. And then how does he get the 10 commandments? Through the finger of God. So I just thought I'd point out, it's kind of interesting that the magicians use that word finger. The magicians no longer tried to replicate the signs and miracles. So as we go through the rest of the plagues, we don't see the magicians of Egypt trying to replicate these plagues. In other words, as soon as basically the lice come out, the gnats, that's it. They realize they can't do that. They basically stop at the frogs. So the 10 plagues of Egypt, plague number 1, we had blood in the river Nile. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Magicians were able to perform the same miracle. Plague number 2, the frogs. Pharaoh's heart was softened long enough to ask Moses to pray and tell the frogs to go away. When Moses did so, Pharaoh's heart was hardened again. Magicians were also able to perform this trick. Plague number 3, the gnats, or the head lice, as we saw from the King James Version, or the lice, sorry. Again, we saw the Pharaoh's heart was hardened, except this time the magicians could not perform the trick. They said this was the finger of God. So at least the magicians in Egypt were able to acknowledge the God of Israel as God. The Pharaoh, on the other hand, did not take their consultation. The fourth plague, masses of flies. So we look back at lice. Now we're going to look at flies. Exodus 8:20-23. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning, and when Pharaoh goes out to the water, stand before him and tell him that this is what the Lord says: Let my people go, so that they may worship me. But if you will not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies upon your officials and your people and your houses. The houses of the Egyptians and even the ground where they stand will be full of flies. But on that day, I will give special treatment to the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be found there. In this way, you will know that I, the Lord, am in the land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This sign will take place tomorrow." When we take a look at the word swarm, the word swarm in Hebrew is arob. Basically, it means a group of insects. We don't know what kind of insect. Could be flies, could be something else. It's just a swarm of something, swarm of insects. So 10 plagues of Exodus, we have blood in the river Nile, the frogs, gnats or lice, as King James Version tells us, and then we have the flies, or just a swarm of insects. What we see here is we see that his heart was softened, and then his heart became hardened and he was warned. Because, of course, once the Pharaoh said that he would let the people go, when he decides not to because his heart is hardened, that is now false testimony. So now the Pharaoh is sinning. And so that's why you see in subsequent conversations, the Pharaoh admits his sin. The sin being that he said initially, I will let your people go on a condition, and then he's not fulfilling that condition, which makes it a false testimony. Exodus 8. The Lord told Moses to let his people go, or the Nile would teem with frogs and would overwhelm Egypt and all of its places. Moses told Aaron to stretch out his hand and staff over the rivers, canals, and ponds which caused the frogs to cover Egypt. The magicians of the Pharaoh were able to do the same, and they also brought forth frogs. The Pharaoh called for Moses and told him to pray to the Lord to send the frogs away, and then he would let his people go. So here we can see this was the first time the Pharaoh actually agreed to let the people go. Moses told the Pharaoh that he may have the honor as to choosing when. Moses prayed for the frogs to be taken away, and the Pharaoh said tomorrow. So Moses is setting the stage here, so that way the Pharaoh can't deny that it was through the power of the Lord and the request and prayer that Moses put in that made the frogs go away. That's why Moses specifically asked the Pharaoh, tell me, when do you want them to go away? That way he would know that it was the work of the Lord through Moses. Moses cried to the Lord for help, and the frogs across Egypt died and were piled into heaps that created a stench in the land. So the frogs didn't just disappear. They didn't hop back to the river Nile. They died and they started to rot. Pharaoh was relieved by this, and his heart was once again hardened, and he would not listen to Moses as the Lord had said. So initially he said to Moses, yeah, I'll let your people go if you get rid of these frogs. Frogs are gone. Pharaoh goes back to a hardened heart. The Lord told Moses to see Pharaoh and ask again to let his people go, to worship him, or Egypt would be filled with flies. But the land of Goshen would see no swarms, so the Pharaoh could see the distinction between his people and the Egyptians. So basically, God was going to make it known. These are my people versus these are your people, by actually targeting specifically with these miracles, which we weren't seeing in the beginning. When the land filled with flies, Pharaoh told Moses and Aaron to go sacrifice to their God within this land. Moses said he could not, because the Israelite sacrifices were detestable to the Egyptians, and they would stone him. So they must take 3 days' journey into the wilderness as God commanded. We saw in earlier chapters of the Bible that the Egyptians looked at the Israelites differently. And as a matter of fact, when we saw Joseph sitting with his brothers in Genesis, the Egyptians actually sat at a completely separate table. So obviously the customs and traditions of the Israelites versus the Egyptians were so different that the Egyptians found it detestable. So what Moses was talking about specifically here was probably animal sacrifice. I don't think animal sacrifice was something that was very widely practiced, or maybe even at all, in Egypt. And so, of course, to see the Israelites slaughtering animals was probably something that was very disgusting to them. The Pharaoh agreed with his terms and told Moses to not go far as well to pray for him. Moses told the Pharaoh that the flies would depart tomorrow, but the Pharaoh must not act deceitfully again by refusing to let the people go and sacrifice to the Lord. So Moses is addressing the fact that sin has occurred, and the sin was false testimony. It's false testimony being obviously that the Pharaoh had said on an earlier occasion, I will let your people go if you pray to your Lord, but he didn't fulfill his promise. So Moses is addressing this by warning him, you must not act deceitfully. Moses prayed to the Lord, and the swarms of flies were removed. And the swarms of flies were removed. But again, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not let the people go. So just like we saw in Exodus 4, remember, Exodus 4 told us, it gave us a hint that until the first child was born, we were going to see a Pharaoh with a hardened heart, because we actually saw that symbol going all the way back 4 chapters ago. Now we're moving into Exodus 9. In Exodus 9, we see the 5th plague. The 5th plague is the death of all livestock. Exodus 9, 1-4 reads, Then the Lord said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh and tell him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. But if you continue to restrain them and refuse to let them go, then the hand of the Lord will bring a severe plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, camels, herds, and flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. So again, we see this separation. We see a separation between the Egyptians and the Israelites. So it's a targeted approach. It's not going to be the whole land just gets affected by the plague. It's your people will be affected, but my people will not be affected. This is actually quite similar to what we see later in the New Testament, where it talks about he will separate the sheep from the goats. Because right now what you're seeing is the separation. You're seeing the separation of God's people from the others. So with our 10 plagues of Egypt, we're now up to number 5. Our first plague being blood in the river Nile. The outcome was the Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He wasn't impressed. The magicians could do it. Then we saw the plague of an infestation of frogs. The Pharaoh's heart was softened while he asked Moses to pray for him. But after Moses prayed for him and the frogs went away, Pharaoh's heart was hardened again, and the magicians were also able to perform the same trick. The third plague, which was the plague of gnats or lice, we find again the Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and that's it. And the magicians were not able to perform this trick. And telling the Pharaoh that they were not able to perform this magic, it didn't change the Pharaoh's mind. Then we see the next plague, which is the plague of flies. We see Pharaoh's heart is once again softened, just like it was with the frogs. And then he asked Moses to go and pray. And then after Moses prayed, once again, his heart became hardened, and Moses warned him not to act deceitfully. But again, the magicians are unable to perform this plague. And then we see the 5th plague, which is livestock. Again, we see the Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and the magicians, they're out of the picture. Now I move on to the 6th plague. The 6th plague is disease or boils, cysts. Exodus 9, 8-9. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Take handfuls of soot from the furnace in the sight of Pharaoh. Moses is to toss it into the air. It will become fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on man and beast throughout the land. We look at our 10 plagues of Egypt. We've just added another one to the list, which is boils. The boils did not shift Pharaoh at all. Frogs and flies softened him, but the boils and the livestock did not affect his heart whatsoever. He remained hard the whole time. Again, no word from the magicians. The magicians tapped out after the gnats. The 7th plague, storm and giant hail. Exodus 9, 18-19. Behold, at this time tomorrow I will rain down the worst hail that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded until now. So give orders now to shelter your livestock and everything that you have in the field. Every man or beast that remains in the field and is not brought inside will die when the hail comes down upon them. Throughout the land of Egypt, hail struck down everything in the field, both man and beast. It beat down every plant of the field and stripped every tree. The only place where it did not hail was in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. So again, we can see another targeted approach. Israelites are spared. They are not affected by this plague. So this should really start to open up the eyes of the Egyptians. When they start to see now multiple plagues and see Moses come and tell them before it happens. But now it's getting more intense, because as the plagues start to increase in regards to their severity, we start to notice that all of a sudden one group of people is not being targeted. The Lord displayed control of his power on 3 occasions, targeting everyone but his people. We see the Israelite livestock did not die. That was the 5th plague. In the 7th plague, the Israelites were not affected by the hail. And then later we'll see in the 10th plague, the Israelites' firstborn did not die. So on 3 occasions, the Lord specifically targeted plagues on Egypt without touching any of his people. So with the 10 plagues of Egypt, the 10 plagues of Egypt, we're up to number 7 now. We've got blood in the river Nile, frogs, we've got the gnats, which are lice, flies or swarms of insects, livestock that were killed. We've got the boils, and now we've got hailing and storming. And then with the hailing and storming, again, we see that the Pharaoh's heart was softened for the 3rd time. So his heart was softened. He admitted his sin. He admitted his sin to Moses, and then his heart hardened again. The Pharaoh told Moses he would let his people go several times. During the 2nd plague with the infestation of the frogs, that's Exodus 8 and 8. During the 4th plague with the swarm of flies, Exodus 8:25 and 8:32. And then during the 7th plague with the storm and hail, Exodus 9:27. Exodus 9:34 reads, when Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had ceased, he sinned again and hardened his heart. So what was his sin? It says he sinned again, and then it says he hardened his heart. Obviously, the sin was that he said, I will let you go if you do blank, and he didn't. And so this is the sin. The hardening of his heart is him undoing his own word. His own word, that's a big deal as a king, because when we look in the New Testament, for example, we see, for example, John the Baptist. John the Baptist was beheaded at the request of a woman who placed it with the king. And the king said he would fulfill any request that she had. So for a king to go back on his request, it's kind of deplorable. So the big question is, why did the Lord harden the heart of the Pharaoh? Why put the Egyptians through all this turmoil? What was the point behind this? Exodus 9:15 and 16. For by this I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague to wipe you off the earth. So this is speaking to the Pharaoh. But I have raised you up for this very purpose. So we're talking about the Lord speaking now to the Pharaoh and the Egyptians through the prophet. And we can see here that the Pharaoh was specifically raised up for this very purpose that's happening right now. That I might display my power to you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So this display of power was not just for the Israelites to leave Egypt, because if the Lord wanted to have the Israelites leave Egypt, he could have struck the Egyptians with a plague that would have been so rough right off the get-go that they would have been wiped out and they would have just walked out of there. But instead, what he did was he wanted to prove his power to not just his own people, but to all the nations of the earth. And if you're wondering why, you got to go back to Genesis 11. In Genesis 11, we read about the Tower of Babel. Since Babylon, the nations were divided amongst the sons of God. We haven't read it yet, but you're going to come to this in the book of Deuteronomy. Exodus 9:15 and 16, or my apologies, this isn't Exodus, this is actually Deuteronomy. So this is Deuteronomy chapter, I believe, 32, starting at verse 7. So Deuteronomy 32, verse 7. Remember the days of old. Consider the years long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you. Your elders, and they will inform you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of God. It's right there. And people miss it when they read Deuteronomy. These other gods that you see in the other nations, like India and Iran and just all over Africa, Egypt, Africa is Egypt. These different gods that were being worshipped amongst the land, these are the sons of God that were mentioned in Deuteronomy. So in other words, after Babel, what God did was he said, all right, well, if you want to fight against me, well, then I will divide you amongst the sons of God. I will divide you amongst the angels. But then you see in verse 9, it says, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. So in other words, all the other nations of the world, they were divided amongst the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, the angels. However, the Lord kept a portion for himself. And so, of course, we saw through Abraham, came Isaac, and then Jacob. That was his inheritance. Everything else was accounted to the sons of God. So obviously, by the Lord showing his power in Egypt, it's going to show the Egyptians and the surrounding lands that the gods that they worship, they aren't so supreme. In other words, it will dethrone the sons of God. The Lord is proving to the other nations that he is supreme among the sons of God. He created the sons of God. As a matter of fact, you can see it very clearly when you read Psalms 82. If anyone thinks that God is a Trinity, read Psalms 82. You're going to have a problem. Psalms 82, 1-8. God presides in the divine assembly. The first thing you should be asking is, what is the divine assembly? He renders judgment among the gods. Wait a minute. God rendering judgment among gods? I thought there's just one God. We'll get there. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Defend the cause of the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the rights of the afflicted and oppressed. Rescue the weak and needy. Save them from the hand of the wicked. They do not know or understand. They wander in the darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I have said, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. But like mortals, you will die. And like rulers, you will fall. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance. Now look at this. In Psalms 82, look how it ends. It says, arise, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance. We saw in Deuteronomy, who was his inheritance? Who was the inheritance of the Lord? Jacob. But now all of a sudden we're seeing in Psalms 82, all the nations are your inheritance. So what's going on in Egypt is these are the moves that God is making to make it so that all the nations see the Lord as God. And if you take a look, you'll notice it says, he renders judgment among the gods. So then Elohim renders judgment among the Elohim. So of course, if you only have the ideas of Father, Son, Holy Spirit in your head, is he rendering judgment among Christ and the Holy Spirit? You're missing something here. And notice what it says following. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? The sons of God were showing partiality to wicked rulers. And we see that in other parts of the book. We saw in the book of Ezekiel, for example, we saw there was an oppressive king in Ezekiel 28, and that oppressive king was then pulled down to the grave. We saw something similar in Isaiah. So what we see here is we see that God had appointed the sons of God in Deuteronomy to rule over the other nations. And then in Psalms 82, we see that their rulership was pretty crappy. It was biased. It wasn't fair. And then we see in Psalms 82:6 that these angels, they are going to die just like mortal men. Now, this actually takes us right to the New Testament, where we talk about the book of Ephesians, Ephesians chapter 6, where it talks about forces and principalities and spiritual wickedness ruling in high places. You're looking at it right here. Spiritual wickedness in high places is what's being talked about in Psalms 82. The wicked ones that are ruling and judging unjustly, showing partiality to the wicked, they are up above. They are the ones that are up above. They're not the ones that have been cast down low. In Psalms 82, if you take a look, it says, a psalm of Asaph, God. So if we look at the first word, the very first word of Psalms 82, Elohim. And if we look at the last word of Psalms 82, Elohim. So God is judging amongst the gods. Elohim is judging amongst the Elohim. If Elohim was just Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, this doesn't make any sense. But once you start to understand that the Benai Elohim, the sons of God, Genesis 6:4, this is what we're looking at. Elohim does not only refer to heavenly, so my apologies, this is a typo. Elohim does not only refer to the Trinity, it refers to heavenly beings. The sons of God, Benai Elohim, are the gods, worshipped by the other nations like Egypt. Overview of Exodus 9. The Lord told Moses to let his people go, or he would bring a plague on all the livestock of Egypt, but not touching an animal of Israel. When the Lord killed the Egyptian livestock, but none of the animals of Israel died, the Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. The Lord told Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of ash and throw it into the air in front of the Pharaoh, which would cause festering boils to break out on man and beast, but the Lord continued to harden Pharaoh's heart. The Lord told Moses to tell Pharaoh again to let his people go, or he would send all the plagues against the Egyptians. The Lord stated he could have already wiped out the Pharaoh and the Egyptians from the earth, but raised the Pharaoh up specifically for the purpose of displaying his powers to the Pharaoh, so the name of the Lord would be proclaimed throughout the earth. So remember, we were talking about the sons of God. Well, we know that all these different nations, they had a principality that was over them. So when we think of the word principality, the root of the word is principle, When you think of a principal, think of a school, for example. You have the principal who is in head of all the teachers. The principal is a ruler over an area. The area that he's ruling over is the school. The sons of God, or the principalities, they are ruling over a physical area. That's why you would see that there's different spirits associated to each nation. And then Jerusalem, Israel, that was associated specifically to the God of the Bible. The Lord made it rain hail over Egypt, striking down both man, beast, and plant, stripping every tree, but did not touch the land of Goshen. The Pharaoh summoned Moses and admitted his sin, stating the Lord is righteous and he and his people were wicked, asking Moses to pray for the hail to stop. Moses said he would spread his hands to the Lord to cease the thunder and hail, but he knew that the Pharaoh and his officials still did not fear the Lord. When Moses spread his hands to the Lord, the storm stopped, but the Pharaoh sinned again and hardened his heart. Bonus content. The bonus content we're going to look at today is, was the staff of Moses a serpent or a dragon? I'm not sure if you've encountered this before, but we're going to look at it today. If we look at Exodus 4:3 and we compare with Exodus 7:9, there's a difference, and it's not just the English. Exodus 4:3, throw it on the ground, says the Lord. So Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. So this is when Moses was speaking to the Lord before even approaching the Pharaoh, back in Exodus 4. In Exodus 7, this is when it's actually happening. Pharaoh will demand, show me a miracle. When he does this, say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down in front of the Pharaoh, and it will become a serpent. So if you're just saying, well, serpent and snake, they're the same thing, that's not what I'm referring to. Behind these words, we're going to take a look at both the Hebrew and we're going to take a look at the Greek. Starting with the Hebrew, we're looking at Exodus 7:10, and then we're looking at Exodus 7:10 in the Greek. So in the Hebrew, we get the word serpent. And then if we take a look in the Greek, we get the word dragon. If we go to Exodus 4:3, we see again in Hebrew the word serpent, and then in Greek we see the word serpent. But again, we're looking at English. We need to look at the underlying Greek words, and we have to look at the underlying Hebrew words, because if you haven't noticed between these two slides, the Hebrew letters are different between Exodus 4 and Exodus 7, and the Greek letters are different between Exodus 4 and Exodus 7, but it's the same word translated in English. Means we've got a problem. Let's look. In Exodus 4, we see the word serpent, but in Exodus 7, when speaking to the Pharaoh, the word is much closer related to a dragon. So let's look at Exodus 4 and 7 in the Hebrew. Exodus 4:3 uses the word 5175 nakash. That's actually the same word that we see back in Genesis 3 when we first see the serpent. So Exodus 4 definitely looks like it says the word serpent. Exodus 7, we see a different Hebrew word, but it's also translated as serpent. It's 8577. The word isn't nakash, the word is tanan. Tanan is translated to mean dragon, sea monster, serpent, jackal, marine or land monster. It's quite flexible. If we take a look in Exodus 4:3 in the Greek, we've got the word 3789, which is ophis. Ophis means serpent, snake, or evil person in Greek. As a matter of fact, there was a place called Delphi, and there was a religion called the Ophites. And Ophites were like Greeks that were worshiping serpents. So when you see this word ophis, yeah, ophis is very strongly connected to the word serpent. But then we have another word. Exodus 7:10, we have the word drakon. And drakon, it looks just like the English word dragon. So you can clearly tell it says dragon. It's a totally different Greek word. So both the Greek and the Hebrew translation showed in Exodus 7, specifically when dealing with the Pharaoh, a totally different word than when Moses was talking to God when he was at the mountain before approaching the Pharaoh. The word dragon can also be translated as dragon, alligator, jackal, or a male goat. That was really interesting. The word dragon that we're looking at in the Greek is actually the exact same word dragon that we see in Revelation 12:9. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. If you take a look below, I have the exact verse, Revelation 12:9, written in the Greek, and you can see it's that same word that we see in the Old Testament and the Greek Septuagint. So it looks like God is alluding to something. Obviously, what we're dealing with in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, has something to do with what we see going back in Exodus. The spelling of dragon in Exodus 7 of the Greek Septuagint is the same as the dragon in Revelation 12. The dragon in the Bible is Satan. When we look at the word Tanum, I actually took the word Tanum and I threw it into a Hebrew translator. I wanted to see what the translator would say. And the translator didn't come up with dragon, it came up with alligator. When Moses was scared by the staff, it turned into a serpent, which was meaningful to the Israelites. You have to remember, in the Old Testament, when we were looking in Genesis, and we're looking at this warning that we see basically from Genesis 3, we knew that there was going to be an enmity placed between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And we saw that the descendants would tell their children, beware that there would be a serpent, and the serpent would bruise the heel of the woman, and the woman would bruise the head of the serpent. So the serpent is a meaningful symbol to an Israelite, but the symbol to an Egyptian might have a different appeal. But what the Pharaoh saw was the staff transform into something resembling an alligator or a crocodile. Why did this happen? What I think the Lord was doing was first showing a symbol that meant something to Moses. Moses and his ancestors were taught to be aware of a serpent. The Pharaoh, on the other hand, didn't grow up in that tradition. However, what the serpent turned into in this case happens to be an alligator. So does the alligator or a crocodile have any kind of meaning to an Egyptian? The answer is yes. If we look in Egypt, you can see we looked at Ramses, which is in the north. So Lower Egypt was actually the upper part, and then Upper Egypt was the lower part. So it's reversed. We studied the city of On, but if you look below the city of On and below Memphis, there's actually a place that's called Crocodipolis. So this was actually named by the Greeks. It was called Fayum. Fayum is the Egyptian name. Let me see if I pronounce this right. Crocodilopolis. I always have problems with these Greek names. Yeah, that was a place in Egypt. So as you can tell by the name, it probably has something to do with a crocodile. Crocodipolis was the capital of Egypt during the 12th dynasty. Sobek was the ancient Egyptian god of crocodiles and controlled the waters. Sobek's role was to protect the pharaoh from evil, but it differs with each person. He was the most popular god in Arsnio, or Crocodipolis in Greek, and was considered the lord of Fayu. So Fayu was the old name of Crocodipolis. So both places are both associated with the same god, which is Sobek. So Sobek was the god of Crocodipolis. He is associated with the Nile crocodile or the West African crocodile and is represented either in its form or as a human with a crocodile head. Here's the interesting part. Sobek was also associated with pharaonic power. So when Moses was throwing that staff on the ground and it turned into a crocodile, that was basically an opposition to the pharaonic power. That's a symbol of Sobek. Fertility and military prowess, but served additionally as a protective deity with apotropaic qualities invoked particularly for protection against the dangers presented by the Nile. Though Sobek was worshipped in the Old Kingdom, he truly gained prominence in the Middle Kingdom, most notably under the 12th dynasty pharaoh Amenemhat III. Amenemhat had taken particular interest in Fayum of Egypt, a region heavily associated with Sobek. Amenemhat and many of his dynastic contemporaries engaged in building projects to promote Sobek, projects that were often executed in Fayum. In this period, Sobek also underwent an important change. He was often fused with the falcon-headed god of the divine kingship, Horus. This brought Sobek even closer with the kings of Egypt, thereby giving him a place of greater prominence in the Egyptian pantheon. The fusion added a finer level of complexity to the god's nature as he was adopted into the divine triad of Horus and his two parents, Osiris and Isis. So you can call him Horus or Sobek Ra. Sobek Ra, you can tell they merged him with the Egyptian god Ra, the chief deity. Sobek was first acquired a role as a solar deity through his connection to Horus, but this was further strengthened in later periods with his emergence of Sobek Ra, a fusion of Egypt's primary sun god, Ra. Sobek Horus persisted as a figure in the New Kingdom, but it was not until the last dynasties of Egypt that Sobek Ra gained prominence. This understanding of the god was maintained after the fall of Egypt's last native dynasty in the Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt. So in other words, once we saw the Greeks and Romans come in and take over Egypt, so Alexander the Great, he took over Egypt, and then following this, the Romans took over Egypt. This god Sobek actually continued his reign all the way through that period. So Sobek basically lasted in regards to worship for over 2,000 years. The prestige of both Sobek and Sobek Ra endured this time period, and tributes to him attained greater prominence both through expansion of his dedicated cultic site and concerted scholarly effort to make him the subject of religious doctrine. So the worship of Ra. So when we look at Sobek, Sobek is no different than Ra because he was fused together. So if we look at both Upper and Lower Egypt, we can see that Ra was worshipped everywhere because Sobek is just another example of Ra. So we can see Ramses. Ramses was actually the name of multiple pharaohs, but Ramses gets his name from Ra. And the city of On, which is Heliopolis, we already studied that. The city of Heliopolis gets its name from Ra. Heliopolis or Helios was Ra. And now we have farther south, this Crocodilopolis, which again is going to connect us back to the Egyptian god Ra. So Ra was worshipped all throughout Egypt. It just looks like he had different manifestations. Sobek was another manifestation of the Egyptian god Ra. Egyptian dynasties. The worship of Sobek reached its peak during the 12th dynasty, which was around the time when Joseph was collecting land on the behalf of Pharaoh during the famine. So if we go back to Genesis 47 and we look at verses 20 to 21, remember, Joseph was put in charge of the land of Egypt. And so basically he was giving out all of the grain to the people who would come who had no more food. So when the people had ran out of money, then at that point, he was collecting their land, their houses, and their cattle. This is the period of time when Sobek had reached his climactic point of worship. This was just at the point when we see Israel living in Egypt and starting to bring his family over. Or Joseph, sorry. Sometime around 1539 BC, the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amos defeated the Hyksos and expelled them from Egypt. Egypt rose to prominence once more as its kings exerted control over the lands to the north and south. The most powerful king, Thutmose I, made repeated campaigns to the north, reaching as far as the Euphrates. Hatshepsut belongs to this dynasty, as do the heretic king, King Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, and the boy king Tutankhamun. So a lot of people know King Tut. King Tut comes from this 18th dynasty. Akhenaten, if you're not familiar with Akhenaten, Akhenaten is where they believe monotheism came from. But actually, I looked, it might actually be a couple dynasties before Akhenaten. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you a pharaoh that might have a lot to do with monotheism in Egypt and sun worship in Egypt. But also, he's likely the pharaoh that was during the Exodus. So I'll show you that in just a moment. Just a sec. So the next question is, and I was waiting for this until we got there, and we're there now. So who was the Pharaoh during the Exodus? If we're going to prove that the Bible is real, let's prove who the Pharaoh was. If you watch the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, the Pharaoh that they use in that movie is Pharaoh Ramses I. He's the Pharaoh of Exodus 1 who desired to kill the firstborn male Israelites. So if you remember, when we're reading through the first chapter of Exodus, the Pharaoh at that time was starting to see that the Israelites were growing too strong, and so he gave the order to kill the firstborn males. And he was telling the maidservants, basically, who were helping the mothers give birth, to kill the firstborn children. The Pharaoh at that time in the Charlton Heston movie was believed to be Pharaoh Ramses. The reason why I'm making a distinction is because there was actually multiple pharaohs throughout this period of the Exodus. It doesn't list their names, but the time periods is how we know. So the Pharaoh of Exodus of Israel, so when Moses said, "Let my people go," and he split the sea and walked between it, that was the next Pharaoh. So the first Pharaoh was the one that was trying to kill the firstborn males. That was Ramses I. That was according to the movie The Ten Commandments. And then the let my people go, the Pharaoh who was washed away in the water, that was supposed to be Ramses II. Again, this is according to the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. From my research, though, this doesn't quite add up, and I'll show you why. I have a different Pharaoh that I believe is the Pharaoh that is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is not the only hypothesis behind the Pharaohs of Exodus, by the way. There's several different hypotheses in regards to which one of the pharaohs was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So I will show you all of them. Possible Exodus pharaohs. Below are a list of possible pharaohs that have been presented by historians as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So we have Dunamis. Dunamis II died in 1690 BC. We have Ahmose I, who I mentioned, 1550 to 1525 BC. We have Thutmose II, 1493 to 1479 BC. We have Pharaoh Akhenaten, 1353 to 1349 BC. The one from the movie The Ten Commandments, Ramses II, 1279 to 1213 BC. Then we have Mernpa, 1213 to 1203 BC. And excuse my pronunciation, Setnakti, 1189 to 1186 BC. And the last one is Ramses III, 1186 to 1155. That's pretty late. So I'll tell you who I think it is. I've highlighted two names. They're highlighted in gold. I believe the Pharaoh that was killing children in Exodus, or trying to kill the children in Exodus 1, is Pharaoh Ahmose. I believe the Pharaoh of the Exodus, where Moses had finally said, let my people go, and then they walked between the sea, that was Pharaoh Thutmose II, and I'll show you why. So as I said, I hold the opinion that Pharaoh Ahmose I was the oppressive ruler in Exodus 1 to 2 and 2 to 23. Pharaoh Thutmose II was the ruler during the Exodus, 1493 to 1479. This theory is also held by Alfred Edersheim. He proposes in an Old Testament Bible history that Thutmose II is best qualified to be the Pharaoh of Exodus based on the fact that he had a brief, prosperous reign and then a sudden collapse with no legitimate son to succeed him. His widow Hatshepsut then became the first regent. So in other words, this was a female pharaoh. So what happened was when Thutmose II died, there was no heir that was ready. So his wife then had to take the spot as pharaoh. So she became the first regent. Then pharaoh in her own right. Edersheim states that Thutmose II is the only pharaoh's mummy to display cysts, possible evidence of plagues that spread throughout Egypt and the Hittite empires at the time. So not only did this pharaoh die suddenly without an heir and his wife had to take over, what we have here is a pharaoh that has visible markings of having a plague, but it wasn't just him. If we take a look, when did the plagues happen? Or when did the plague happen regarding the boils, or the cysts in this case? Boils, cysts, that's the sixth plague. The sixth plague, we saw that the Pharaoh's heart was hardened. The magicians, they were tapped out at that point, but the sixth plague was the boils. If you take a look at this website, it's News Network Archaeology. Reign of Pharaoh Thutmose II suggests crisis. Further, there is evidence that disease affected the royal court before the reign of Hatshepsut. The mummy of Thutmose II is the only corpse of a pharaoh during the 18th dynasty covered with cysts from an unknown malady. These lesions coat the back, waist, arms, and legs of Thutmose II and exhibit a mixture of papules, scabs, and scars up to several centimeters in length. These cysts also cover the corpse of the wet nurse, Sitirin, who was probably unrelated to the royal lineage. In addition, Hatshepsut and her successor, Thutmose III, bear traces of this disease on their skin healed after a period of time. So we can see it wasn't just Thutmose who had these cysts on his body, it was other people that were living in that time in Egypt as well, such as his wife and his son. He had a son, but the problem was his son was way too young. It wasn't actually his son either. Thutmose III was far too young to rule, which is the reason why Hatshepsut became regent and then pharaoh. This is most likely who the pharaoh was of the Exodus, because all these points seem to match. He dies early. He dies early of an unknown malady. He dies early without an heir, and he's covered with cysts of an unknown ailment. It also matches our timeline. The Egyptian dynasties. So 1539 BC to 1075 BC, we're looking at the New Kingdom, dynasties 18 to 20. The oppressive Pharaoh from Exodus 1 can be explained by Pharaoh Amos. So if you're trying to figure out why was the Pharaoh in Exodus 1 trying to kill the Israelite children, I think there's a little bit more than they were just growing in power. You have to remember, what was the dynasty that came before? The Hyksos dynasty. And the Hyksos dynasty were foreigners from Canaan that were ruling over the Egyptians, and they did not like that. And they tried to erase that history afterwards. So you can imagine then that if there were foreigners that were ruling over Egypt, and then they were shooed out of Egypt, and then there's other foreigners living in Egypt, they're probably not going to be very fair with them, because those individuals are basically going to take some of the flack of the people who were ruling before, since they were also foreigners. So sometime around 1539 and the 18th dynasty, Pharaoh Amos defeated the Hyksos and expelled them from Egypt. The Hyksos composed the only non-Egyptian dynasty, and they were from Canaan. It is most likely the rise of Joseph in Egypt was assisted by the Hyksos rulers, as they would have no issue giving a foreigner power, since they were not from Egypt themselves. After the Hyksos were expelled, Amos I likely oppressed any foreigners who remained in Egypt, as the Egyptians were very upset that they are ruled by foreigners to begin with. So it's quite likely that the situation with the Hyksos ruling Egypt is what led to the oppression of the Israelites, because when foreigners are ruling over Egypt and then they're shooed out and now there's other foreigners still remaining in Egypt, they're probably taking out their aggression that they still had on the Hyksos and their rules on the Israelites. It's also possible that the Hyksos may have been some of the Israelites as well. As a matter of fact, if you read the book called The Antiquities of the Jews by a man called Josephus, Josephus wrote in years very early following Christ that the word Hyksos meant shepherd king. Now, of course, when we think of shepherd kings, it kind of points us back to the Israelites. We know that they were shepherds, they were nomads, they tended their flocks and moved around with them. And of course, when we look at the Jews, Judah specifically, that was a bloodline of kings. So for the Hyksos to be called shepherd kings, it could be alluding to the fact that they were the kings in Egypt who were the shepherds from Canaan, and they were Israelites, or it could have just been other people that were in Canaan, and maybe they were getting mixed up with the Israelites. Keep in mind, they're both foreigners from Canaan, if that situation is that the Israelites are not the Hyksos. There was more than one Pharaoh who ruled during the Exodus. So following Pharaoh Amos coming into power as Pharaoh, Thutmose died prematurely and had cysts on his body, as did his wife and many others, which points to the sixth plague of Exodus. So I hold the opinion that Pharaoh Amos was the Pharaoh that was killing or trying to kill the children in Exodus 1. And I hold that the Pharaoh that was washed away in the water, who died prematurely, the same Pharaoh that would have been afflicted with the boils in the sixth plague, I believe that's Thutmose II. Our reading for next week, we're going to read Exodus chapters 10 to 12.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.